Chapter 19: The Ashanti Problem. About this time, it became clear to me that further steps were necessary to control the price paid locally to the cocoa farmers. Otherwise, we would shortly be faced with inflation. Demand in the world market had far exceeded the supply of cocoa, and the price had risen to a record height. If a proportionately high price were paid locally to the farmers, there would be an immediate rise in prices of consumer goods, followed by a demand for wage and salary increases. The development plan that was under way would be affected, since it would not be possible to keep within the limits of the finance agreed upon. And the second development plan, which was being drawn up, would be impossible to carry out owing to the greatly increased costs that had not been reckoned upon. Cocoa was, and still is, the mainstay of our national economy. It accounted for 68% of exports in 1955. It belongs to the country and it affects everyone. So we had to think of the general public as well as the cocoa farmers. I considered that it was not in the best interest of the country to be subjected to considerable or frequent fluctuations in the local price paid to the farmers, and that the present price that was being paid to them was both fair and reasonable and offered an incentive for increased production. It was also in the interest of the cocoa farmers that they should receive a steady income over a period of years. On the 10th of August, 1954, therefore, the Cocoa Duty and Development Funds Amendment Bill was introduced into the Assembly and passed 3 days later with the blessing of the opposition members. The effect of this bill was to fix the price paid to cocoa farmers at 72 shillings a load for 4 years, that is, during the life of that assembly. The government guaranteed to pay this price irrespective of how low the world price of cocoa might fall during that period of time, and the funds that accrued to the government would be used on expanding the economy of the country as a whole, with special emphasis on agriculture. It was important to ensure that future generations should be spared the dangers of having to rely on cocoa as their only mainstay, as we had had to. Also, by using cocoa funds for development and for providing amenities, it would be possible to improve the general standard of living in the country as a whole at an early date. The cocoa farmers showed a favorable reaction to the bill, for after experiencing the way the CPP government had kept their word over the New Deal for cocoa, they had faith that it would do so again in this case. But other elements in the country, still laboring to find a chance of attacking the government, picked on this cocoa bill as a heaven-sent opportunity to restart agitation. The result was that a month later, all the remnants of various parties that had been formed at one party or another went against the CPP. They came together as the Council for Higher Cocoa Prices. The Council for Higher Cocoa Prices did not last long and was succeeded by the National Liberation Movement, which put forward as its raison d'etre the demand for a federal form of government. Supporters of this movement endeavored at first to spread discontent with the government throughout Ashanti by what they alleged to be the injustice of the cocoa bill to the Ashanti farmers, and tried to convince the people of how much better off they would all be if they managed their own affairs. At this time, allegations were made that the money which the cocoa growers were pouring into the government coffers was being used in developing the coastal or colony region of the country, and that Ashanti, which should be deriving the most benefit from the money, was being neglected. Talk of this sort invites one to point to the gigantic hospital in Kumasi, the new library, the magnificent National Bank building, and numerous other modern constructions that were appearing in the Ashanti region during this particular period. It didn't seem to count the first-class roads that had been built from Kumasi, and that traveling to Accra or elsewhere one spent only a few hours in comfort, where previously one had to give up 1 or 2 days and nights to the journey. Moreover, the NLM did not seem to realize that the cocoa which they felt so possessive about would be worthless without the labor which came mainly from the northern territories and without the exportation which was carried out in the south. The National Liberation Movement and the Asante Council, headed by the Asante joined together to form the opposition. As far as I could see, this was once again an unofficial opposition, for it could not successfully take over if the government went out of office. It was, in my view, a movement on the part of the Asante Council to free themselves and those of the Ashanti people who supported them from the influence of democracy as represented by the Convention People's Party. Later on, with the failure of a purely political campaign, a campaign of violence developed in Ashanti, where the situation became so desperate that hundreds of Ashanti CPP men and women were forced to leave their homes and to seek refuge in other parts of the country. My greatest difficulty at this time was to prevent party members from hitting back. Day by day, delegations would plead with me to let them go up to Kumasi and fight back, but I refused to allow them. We will not retaliate, I said. Be patient a little while and it will all blow over. One could hardly blame them, however, when they became almost mutinous after a sister of Krobo Edusai, who was then National Propaganda Secretary of the CPP, had been shot dead in cold blood in Kumasi, and they insisted that they were going to restrain themselves no longer. I was not unsympathetic, but I was convinced that severe discipline was the only thing that would assure our final victory. To strike back would have caused serious civil disturbance, probably even civil war, and this would have called for a state of emergency to be declared. This, in turn, would have invited intervention from Britain, and in the eyes of the world, there would be no doubt whatever that a country in a state bordering on civil war was hardly in a fit condition to take charge of its own affairs. In this transitional period, we had not got full control of defense. If the police and the army had been in the hands of my government, the revolt, disobedience, and disregard of law, order, and justice in Ashanti would never have happened. As time went on, I was dismayed to find that on the whole the British press appeared to be backing the opposition and the stand which they were taking in Kumasi. One letter, which was published in a London newspaper about this time, forecast widespread bloodshed and accused me of possessing a private army. As a result of this and similar publications, thousands of readers in Britain and elsewhere were given an entirely false picture of domestic trouble in the Gold Coast. It was little wonder that I was forced to the conclusion that at the 11th hour imperialist enemies were still trying to defeat my efforts towards independence. A further cause for unrest in Ashanti occurred when the Bechamene, the Juasohene, and the Juabenhima, the Niamfahene of Kumasi and the Bamuhene of Kumasi, who were all supporters of the government, were destalled by the Asante Council. Under the existing regulations, when a chief was destalled by the state council, he had no right of appeal. I realized that something would have to be done to stop this practice, and in November 1955, an amendment to the State Council Ashanti Ordinance was introduced which permitted those chiefs who had been destalled the right of appeal to the governor. During this month, violence took a personal turn. On the 10th of November, I had an exceptionally heavy cold. As there was a lot of work that I wanted to complete for the following day, I arranged for my secretary, my personal accountant, and several other people to come to my house in that evening. After we had finished most of the work, 4 of us were sitting out on the stoep chatting. It must have been nearly 8 o'clock when we noticed a strong smell of sulphur. Nobody said anything for a while, as we thought someone must have been burning refuse in the yard below, where smoke had started to appear. Then my secretary said, "You know, it smells just like fireworks. It makes me think of Guy Fawkes' Night at Home, and it's only 5 days too late, too." Suddenly, my accountant jumped to his feet. Fireworks! He exclaimed. Yes, you're right. Without saying another word, he and one of the party members who was with us jumped up and tore down the stairs. There was a great deal of commotion going on, and I heard them asking for buckets of water. By this time, the smoke was as dense as a London fog. What do you think it is? My secretary asked me. I don't know, I said, but the smoke is making my cold worse. We were still sitting in our chairs when a bright orange glow suddenly lit up the whole of the back of the house, and there was a violent explosion, followed within seconds by another. The house trembled, windows were broken in, and we could hear the screams of women and children. I went downstairs to find my mother, whose room was very near the explosion. The poor woman was speechless, and there were tears in her eyes as she clutched hold of my arm. Oh, you are safe, she said with relief. I went into her room. There were no windows anymore, and the shattered glass was all over the place, even in her bed. When I got outside, I found practically all my ministers had arrived, worried and breathless. Then I became aware of an agitated buzz which was growing in intensity every minute. What's that? I inquired of Bozio. The people, he said. You can't move on the road outside. The crowd gathered in their hundreds, shouting for me, wanting to see me to know that I was unharmed. Everybody was excited, shocked, and disgusted. The following day, and for weeks afterwards, telegrams, cablegrams, and letters poured into the office congratulating me on my lucky escape and condemning the dastardly act. A few days later, the State Council's bill was read for the second time, and 2 days afterwards it became law. The disorder in Ashanti continued. During those disturbances, I always considered that the unhappy history of Ashanti and the mystery regarding the golden stool, its symbol of feudal power, has made the acceptance and practice of democracy in that part of the country more difficult than elsewhere. Dr. K. A. Busia points to certain practices he found there which could never exist in a democratic society. The most noticeable thing that struck me when I began my inquiries in Kumasi in 1942 was the considerable intrigue that went on regarding constitutional disputes that came before the Confederacy Council. Bribes were given and received in all such cases. It was so common that everybody knew about it and everybody talked about it. When there is a constitutional dispute, both the chief concerned and his opponents, malcontents as they were called, gave bribes to the chiefs, registrars, secretaries, Akiami, who are spokesmen, and others connected with the council to enlist their support. These sums of money are called presents. Besides those who are officially connected with the courts, there are some residents in Kumasi who collect money from the parties to a constitutional dispute, which they promise to take to one or the other of the chiefs known to be sitting on the case, or to the Asante Hene. These men make a living in this way, as besides the money they receive for others, they are paid for their services. Some influential chiefs have agents who are known to have access to them and who collect presents for them in this way. I received and checked up information on a number of such cases. The commoners are not consulted by the chiefs and elders, and they are not given a chance of expressing their views on the matter discussed. The educated commoners feel that they should be represented on the council. One of them, a trader in Kumasi, put the popular view in this way. Every day we see the chiefs going to the council. We have no say in what they discuss. When they come out, they give us laws to obey. Most of these are in their own interest. It is not only the literate commoners who feel that the council is not sufficiently representative. An illiterate cocoa farmer, 60 miles from Kumasi, put what is a general criticism most clearly when he said, "All I know of the Confederacy Council is that whenever the chief comes back from Kumasi, he brings a new law. We must not hold funeral celebrations. We must not plant cocoa. We must pay a levy. When you ask why, they say the council says so, or the Asante Hene ruled it. Today we have too many masters, the district commissioner, the chief, the Asante Hene, they all make laws for us. If this is the case, then nobody, not even a chief, would dare to express publicly his own views on the subject if these were contrary to the wishes and ideas of the Asante Hene and the Kumasi clan chiefs. If a chief did so, he might be destalled, and until the passing of the States Council bills in 1956, he would have had no right of appeal against this. It was the emergence of the CPP in Ashanti that publicly exposed these practices, and not unnaturally, those who have made their living this way regard the Convention People's Party as the greatest enemy. But it is precisely because of what the Ashanti suffered under this autocracy that the CPP got such a firm footing there when it first started. If any man in the whole of the country now understands the meaning of the word freedom, it is an Ashanti. I well remember a most touching sight at one of the rallies I held in Ashanti. After I had been holding forth at some length on the new order, an old man moved towards me, an amazed expression on his face and wonder in his eyes. "Do you mean me?" he asked. "Do you mean that I can say whatever I like? That I can stand up in Kumasi and speak of the things that you've just told us? All this in Ashanti?" "Of course," I assured him as I laid my head on his bent shoulders. "Why not? You are the same as the rest of us. If you believe in freedom, then you say so. If the CPP can do this for me, then freedom!" he yelled enthusiastically as he stumped back through the crowd.